Welcome back to DPRK Athletics. Today we're going to be talking about the birth of DPRK women's football. We're going to be focusing on historical factors and international influence, but basically we're just going to talk about how DPRK women's football started and kind of the environment that led up to it and why it started. It's an issue that I was always super interested in because it's just like all of a sudden in the mid-1980s the DPRK started playing women's football. But then before that, they actually discouraged it. So it's a really interesting dynamic to look at. This is a talk I originally gave at the 2025 International Institute of Korean Studies Annual International Conference Series. Basically, the University of Central Lancashire in the United Kingdom or England, they hosted a conference at their Cyprus campus because Britain has a military base in Cyprus in a town called Pyla, and the University of Central Lancashire also has a campus there. And so they kind of hosted it in the divided Cyprus to kind of talk about the divided Korean Peninsula situation. So I had the opportunity to present there. And so now I get to bring it to YouTube and talk to you guys about it. And I think that that's really cool. So it's not just limited to the people or the academics who could go to that conference, but now everybody can kind of hear what I investigated. And I think it'll be really interesting. So let's get straight into it. So this whole presentation is going to kind of lead up to the creation of women's football in 1985. So you kind of need to start off with how football came to the Korean Peninsula and why it was mostly played by men, and how the status of football was during the Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula during the early 20th century. And then you also need to kind of go into the Soviet football culture, because in the Soviet Union, they had a huge influence in the DPRK as it was established as a state. And then you also have to go into DPRK athletics culture before 1985, like why were women not allowed to play football, but they were allowed to play other sports like volleyball and basketball. We'll talk about that. And then in 1985, internationally, like what was the state of women's football? So like what was influencing the DPRK to start it? How had women's football been in the DPRK up to that point? And then we're also going to go into how women's football was started, like, you know, what steps they took to start it. And then we're going to draw some broader conclusions from that. So first, we're going to start with the introduction. So since the beginning of the DPRK as a state, women have been encouraged to take up all varieties of athletics. But until 1985, women's football was not present in the society. So why was women's football absent in the DPRK? Why did Kim Jong-il suddenly give this order to develop women's football on a huge scale? Can we understand more about the DPRK's decision-making and processes for societal change in the DPRK through this analysis? So it's like, how do they make decisions? Like, what causes them to do this? And then we're going to use basically a historical and a situational approach, which I've already kind of described up to this point. So let's go into the background. First of all, football culture before liberation. So football was a part of a broader internationalization and a modernization process. So the first official match involving Korean players was in 1896. It consisted of a mix of officers of the British Marine Guard, British teachers of the Royal English School, and Korean students of the same school. So basically it was imported from abroad. And from 1902, official school football clubs began to be formed. So there was a little bit of a systemization going on. And students on these teams would go on to form athletic societies for adult players. So it started from the school and then it moved to the adults. And there are different approaches to football spread. So Christian missionaries saw football as a vehicle through which to spread their beliefs. So, you know, it's like, okay, if they want to play football, then they'll listen to a religious lecture and they'll go to church, they'll convert to Christianity, that type of thing. And then also, after the Ulsa Treaty of 1905, Korean intellectuals saw football as a way to prepare the next generations for combating Japanese oppression, because after the Ulsa Treaty of 1905, Korea had de facto lost its independence to the Japanese Empire, and Koreans wanted to resist that, so they thought, okay, the best way to do that is to surreptitiously train the physical fitness of the young Koreans, and football was seen as a way to do that. After the March 1st movement, there was limited freedom of Korean organizations, the publishing of Korean newspapers, and freedom of assembly. And I've gone over this in other presentations. There's a little bit of a overlap, but if you're new to this, basically there were 5 aspects of football's development between 1919 and up until the breakout of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937. So you kind of have this 18-year point where football was kind of allowed to semi-freely develop in Korean society at that time, but obviously there were a lot of restrictions placed on it by the Japanese authorities. So there was greater organization and systemization through the establishment of nationwide associations which governed football. Tournaments were organized for Korean teams by Korean officials. Korean players started to play in international football matches for foreign teams. There's a particular case of a player he went to China, he played for China's national team, and then China's national team went to Australia, and so they kind of started to become part of the international football space. Local Korean newspapers, which were mainly for intelligentsia, since the vast majority of the population couldn't read, they began to use their weight to support football and kind of organize Koreans in that way. And then Korean teams were also able to participate and win in Japan-wide football tournaments. I think that this will be an interesting topic to go into in another video, just kind of seeing how teams from Hamhung and teams from Pyongyang were actually able to win against all of the Japanese teams on Japanese soil, which is a really fascinating and inspiring topic. The outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 triggered the gradual shutdown of football in favor of military-style athletics for conscription. So basically, football was kind of phased out, and by the time that the Korean Peninsula was liberated in 1945, there was basically no more football at all being played anywhere. It was all just military-style athletics only. And they were being prepared for conscription into the Japanese army. So how were women's athletics in this time? Because after all, the topic is women's football. So the first women's gymnastics classes, and now when we're thinking gymnastics, we're not really thinking, like tumbling or doing flips or using the pommel horse or anything like that. We're really seeing what's in the picture right to the right of me. We're basically seeing just very basic movements to kind of get your body moving. This is kind of, I wouldn't say primitive, but very basic, very early ways of exercising. So these were introduced at Ihwa University in 1890, which was a pioneer of women's athletics at this time. And of course, there was a great deal of controversy. Many people in the area wanted to see it shut down because under the late Joseon dynasty, which was in power at the time, women really did not have a lot of rights. It's not something I know a great deal about, but basically there were things like women couldn't go outside of the house at certain times of day. Women and men were sleeping in different rooms. Very strict, very old school society. So these women's gymnastics classes were really big. By 1895, girls' gymnastics classes became compulsory. So from that early controversy, all of a sudden, all of the women who were in school had to start doing gymnastics. Primary school in 1895, secondary schools like middle high schools in 1908. After the March 1st movement in 1919, which we discussed on the previous slide, women started to participate in competitive athletics, in small numbers, mostly in higher educational institutions. So, in colleges, women would be allowed to do this, but, in the lower schools or women who didn't go to school, they didn't really have this privilege. The most popular discipline was tennis, but other disciplines were volleyball, basketball, table tennis, ice skating, and judo. So, you have a variety of sports, but obviously like baseball was a lot rarer, football was a lot rarer, you weren't seeing women doing wrestling, so it was really only certain athletics disciplines, and there was always this debate at the time, like what athletics are proper for the women and the female body to do, so it was still very restricted. Women's football did exist, but it was on a much smaller scale, and there were no tournaments of women's football held at this time. Football was a very violent sport, and it was not considered suitable for women at the time. So, that's just kind of the state that things were in due to the conservatism of the society. So, now let's take a step to the left, and let's look at Russian and Soviet women's football culture, like in the Russian Empire and then in 1917 in the Soviet Union, how it developed there, because this is the influence that the DPRK received as it was being established in the late 1940s. So this is really important to know, kind of as background as to what influence in terms of women's football they would be getting from the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. The first football match in the Russian Empire, it took place in 1892. It was in the areas of St. Petersburg and Moscow. And local clubs began in 1903. In 1907, spectators began to gather to huge matches. And then spectator matches were commercialized from 1909. So from early beginnings in the late 1890s, there weren't a lot of rules. They didn't really understand the sport in earnest, but then they really began to modernize, and we kind of started to see it in a commercial form by 1909. But most women did not participate in athletics at all. There were some athletics training classes in schools. A few women were able to participate in weightlifting and wrestling through the circus, but they were barred from joining athletics clubs in a few examples I saw. And so basically, like women's athletics, maybe if you were cosmopolitan, maybe if you were allowed to go to a certain school, maybe if you were a little bit of a radical and you found a way to do it through the circus, but you would kind of be a sideshow. Really, in the Russian Empire, athletics were not widespread for women, especially when we consider areas outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg, areas that were kind of more industrialized at the time. Now, the Soviets come into power and things change a little bit. There were philosophical movements in the government, such as the Proletkult and the hygienist movement, and these movements discouraged football and other athletics disciplines as bourgeoisie, and they encouraged non-competitive disciplines. So it's kind of crazy to think about now, but back in these days, modern athletics were a very new thing. Things like the athletic disciplines we know today, like basketball, football, baseball, they were all invented less than 100 years before that. They weren't necessarily spread throughout the entire world. And so the people were wondering how to reconcile the society with this new thing that was athletics. And in the Soviet Union, they thought, let's get rid of everything that's competitive because we want to kind of train this sporting culture, this ideal sporting body and this sporting mentality that is entirely socialist. And so it can't be competitive. And so that was their idea. But it didn't work because football and boxing, which they also tried to discourage, were just simply too popular amongst the populace. Like, they wanted to do it, and they didn't have as much total control as they thought they did. And of course, this was only certain parts of the government. Like, the government wasn't united in their thought about this. So the military-associated Vsevolbush, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but and other bodies in the government, they actually encouraged football because they thought, oh, this will make more of a collectivist spirit. This will prepare them for the military. So eventually, these are the people who won out. And football grew in popularity during the 1920s, and it began to see a degree of professionalization with, clubs starting to be formed, usually overall sports clubs attached to arms of the government, which is the same thing, the same system that happened in the DPRK. But the first Soviet 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932, this is kind of when you see factory owners taken out, you see just total huge winds of change in society at the time. And so because of that, football was pushed to the background amidst this huge social upheaval that was going on. And it wasn't until after the 5-year plan in the 1930s that it kind of came back to more of a normalization. And so in the 1930s, USSR, an athletic system focusing on Olympic disciplines and rewarding elite athletes began to emerge. So they really are deciding to let's combat the capitalist world. Let's put ourselves out there in competitions like the Olympics, and we'll prove that we're better through the winning golds at international competitions. So that's kind of where this idea starts to come about. And public government opposition to football, it was basically gone at this time. Like they had reformed their, the government had changed basically. Football was the most popular sporting discipline in Russia at this time. So only 30 some years after it was introduced, or 40 some years, it was actually the most popular thing to do amongst people in the USSR, not just Russians, but people in the USSR. And before 1936, national football championships were conducted irregularly between teams of selected players from cities. So this is kind of like before 1972 in the DPRK. But post-1936, like after 1972 in the DPRK, teams composed by societies that practiced together regularly began to participate and regularly play. So there would be a league championship every year, teams would play, and so it kind of resembled more of a modern form. And so this is kind of the state in which USSR football was imported into the DPRK when the DPRK was made as a state. So I think this is important to know. But how were women's athletics in the pre-1945 Soviet Union? We talked about it in the Russian Empire, but in the Soviet Union. They were an essential part of an overall women's emancipation policy in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and the 1930s. But various factors, such as familial obligations, societal stigma, and a lack of female-appropriate equipment, limited the spread of athletics among women at large. So ideologically they supported it, but the material support and then the actual public support weren't necessarily there yet in the 20s and 30s. But by the 1930s, after the societal upheaval of the 5-year plan and everything like that, women began to participate in local physical culture groups and the state physical exam in greater numbers. So more and more women were getting into athletics. And on a small scale, in the 1920s and 1930s, and especially the 20s, which were considered a relatively socially liberal period in the Soviet Union, women actually did participate in football at this time, but on a very limited scale, again. And a tournament was never organized, and by the 1930s, when Stalin and all of the conservatives were in power, they said, no, women's football, this is not proper, this is not a proper thing for women to do, so it was, the nascent women's football scene was totally shut down. And so at this point, we have to ask, why did the Soviets not introduce women's football to Northern Korea? It wasn't the DPRK yet, but when they were setting it up in Northern Korea, why did they not put women's football there? And if we kind of know from what I've shown in the previous slides, they had no precedent with which they could begin women's football in Northern Korea, and they had no motivation, so they didn't include it. And Soviet influence saw a sharp decline after Kim Il-sung purged pro-Soviet Koreans from the government in 1956 and distanced himself from Khrushchev's thaw and became more of a conservative, dictatorial, somewhat repressive regime after that. And Soviet women's football would reemerge in the Ukrainian SSR in the early 1970s, but it was quickly discouraged by the government. And the Soviet Union would not host their first women's football championship until 1988. And this was 2 years after the DPRK had already begun their own women's football championship. So basically, Soviet influence had already waned, and the government never officially supported it until after the DPRK already supported it. So that's why the Soviet Union never was a reason for the DPRK to start women's football. And so now we're going to take a look at women's athletic culture in the DPRK until 1985, kind of look at the internal reasons why there was no women's football up until that point. In pre-war Northern Korea, athletics were gradually geared to follow the Soviet system as a model. Due to the existing athletic structure of the time, athletics for women were still primarily carried out within the school. In 1947, DPRK authorities used the newly formed socialist-modeled youth organizations, which were called the Children's Union, Sonyeondan, and the Democratic Youth League, or Minchong, to encourage athletics in students' extracurricular time. In 1948, the Soviet-modeled physical fitness exam was introduced and saw high participation rates among the youth and women. And the diversity of athletics available to women, as evidenced by the disciplines available at the athletics tournaments at the time, still lagged significantly behind the men. So women were participating in athletics, but again, it was on a smaller scale than the men, mainly because there were less disciplines available to them. But it was still very much more than what was before it. So it was this huge push of progressivism to give women quote unquote equal rights, to give women more opportunities to participate in athletics, but this was still nowhere near kind of an actually equal system. So yeah, think of it that way. In the post-war DPRK, women and society at large began to see more exposure to modern athletics outside of the school. So this is after the Korean War, not during the 40s like we were talking about before. And on the 1st November 1955, the 스포츠 훈련부, or sports training schools, which were focused on athletics training, were installed in numerous provinces, and they began to organize athletics teams at schools, workplaces, and in rural areas. By the end of the next year, around 670,000 people were participating in the resulting athletics teams, and 30% of these participants were women. So we had lots of women participating in athletics. The depletion of the male labor force meant that many women were rising to positions previously held by that of men, such as mechanic, sailor, or party cadre. So all of this is to say that in the late 1950s, women actually had a much greater presence in society than they would have in later decades in the 60s and 70s. And this was reflected by their greater participation in athletics, but also in their ability to participate in like hard labor jobs. So it's a very interesting time, and it was kind of triggered by the lack of a labor force because there was a huge depletion of men who had died in the war. But let's stay focused and talk about women's athletics in 1950s and 1960s DPRK. In the midst of a society-wide push towards productivity, new athletic policies made mandatory athletics time a part of citizens' everyday lives. So basically everybody, until you were retired, from the time you were a small child, everybody had to do athletics for an hour each day. I think this was from 1959. This was codified into law. So it's really a society-wide program to get everybody to do athletics, no matter who you were. Throughout the 1960s, national defense athletics began to see increasing emphasis. Like they always say that athletics are for national defense and for production. And so the national defense aspect of that, as the situation on the Korean Peninsula became a little bit more testy between the North and the South, national defense athletics kind of reemerged so that people would be prepared for any war that might emerge. And in the 1960s and 70s, as I mentioned earlier, women's rights were pushed back. And this is an area that I think needs a lot more study. But what we do know from what is already out there, there was legal systemization of an already somewhat socially accepted gender division of labor. So basically it's like women can't be a sailor, women can't be a miner, women can't lift heavy things, etc. And then like men can't be like a clerk, things like that. It was really a regressive policy. And slowing economy in the 1970s meant less overall demand for labor, meaning that many women fell out of industrial jobs and they became full-time homemakers or joined newly organized domestic work teams. This was accompanied by propaganda saying that women need to be wives, women need to be mothers, women need to be daughters, women need to be homemakers, and everything began to kind of center around this. And there was much less talk of like women being liberated, even though they were still somewhat encouraged to work. They were really kind of pushed back into the traditional role in the propaganda at the time. And there was even a ban on women wearing pants in public, which was only repealed very recently. So you could see that there was still this very conservative, old school idea of what a woman should be. And basically this total stranglehold on power by Kim Il-sung And the subsequent regression of women's rights eliminated any possibility of a domestic movement for women to play football, because, if women aren't supposed to be doing all of this hard labor, then what makes them suitable to play this hard, rough sport of football in the eyes of people at the time? So it was just kind of an environment that was not conducive to women's football developing. But then things change. As time goes on, things change. In the 1970s and 1980s, there is an emphasis on elite athletics. So, spurred by the DPRK's first participation in the Summer Olympics, Kim Il-sung declared in 1971 that the DPRK would be a kingdom of athletics. So, in the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich in Germany, the DPRK participated in the Summer Olympics for the very first time. And so then they're like, all right, we're going to go all in on battling the capitalists, just kind of like the Soviet Union did in the 1930s. And so in 1972, existing athletics clubs began to train in specific disciplines and mandated regular training times. By 1974, Kim Il-sung specified specific athletic disciplines for development. So he's like, okay, we're going to develop this because we're good at it. And we're going to develop that because we're good at it. And then that we're not good at, so we're not even going to mention it. Kind of that type of thing. And during the course of the 1970s, Kim Jong-il began to take more of a direct hand in athletic policy than his father. So I would argue by the mid-1970s, athletics was really more of a Kim Jong-il thing, and Kim Il-sung kind of limited himself to the higher affairs of state by that point. In 1974, Kim Jong-il mandated that all schools begin specializing in one athletic discipline. So this one school will only do basketball, this one school will only do football, things like that. And so that kind of encourages more of a development of elite athletes. In 1977, the Chungang-cheuk-hagwon, or the Central Athletics Academy, was established as an 8-year elite school for athletes. So you have like one central school in Pyongyang that like develops the absolute best athletes. So there was an effort there. By 1980, the Chungang-cheuk-gangbu Yangyongso, or the Central Athletics Cadre Training Center, began a 1-year retraining course for athletics teachers and coaches. So like athletics teachers could kind of, if they had been like out in the field for 10 years, they could go back to school for a year and relearn the latest techniques so they could kind of be more effective and keep up with modern trends. In 1984, the Mobom Cheuk Hakgyo Chingho Chengchui Undong, or the Model Athletics School Title Achievement Campaign, would be carried out with the express purpose of encouraging schools to do well in the discipline they specialized in. So kind of a continuation of Kim Jong-il's order in 1974 for schools to specify one athletics discipline to be good in. By 1984, if they were really good at that discipline, then they would be a model athletics school. So it was all of this emphasis on really training elite athletes, having these elite athletes go into the Olympics or whatever world championship and start to win. And so you can kind of see on this picture on the right, we have Bak Yong-sun, who won 2 individual table tennis medals in the women's category. And she kind of in the mid to late 1970s, and she became a propaganda hero for the DPRK. And so I think one thing that you can't miss when you talk about DPRK athletics is the development of the athletic ideology. So athletics in the early DPRK always carried communist ideological elements, such as emphasizing athletics for purposes of labor and national defense. From roughly 1959, athletics began integrating lessons about and symbolism from Kim Il-sung's revolutionary history. So they became ultra politicized from that point on. And then in the 60s and 70s, there was a system that demanded total loyalty to Kim Il-sung. So like in the 60s, they had this Kim Il-sung, not Kim Jong-il yet, but Kim Il-sung research office installed at every single sports team and sports school. And then by the 1970s, they until the end of the 70s, throughout the 70s, they had this other committee, which I forget the name of. They basically made sure that people were keeping to the party propaganda line. So athletics became really super politicized, and like it was just kind of hand in hand with indoctrination with the system. And Kim Il-sung's emphasis of a Juche-style tactics system in a 1969 speech at a National Athletes Convention gave rise to the concept of Juche athletics. So now, what is Juche athletics? It uses socialist athletic philosophy as a basis, but adds on loyalty to the leader and ethno-nationalist elements. It aims to instill athletes with a sense of loyalty, purpose, and national pride, fearlessness, and mental confidence that helps them win matches and represent the country with a consciousness that is aligned with the government's propagandistic rhetoric. So I came up with that definition myself by just reading related materials. But basically, so think of it, it is socialism, it is socialist, so you're an athlete working for the society, working for the common good, but you need to be loyal to Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. That's what they tacked onto it. And then they also made it ethno-nationalist. So it's, you are Korean, you're doing this for Koreans, so it's basically socialism, Koreanism, and dictatorship, all kind of combined into one. And then, it also kind of combines these elements of like you are a soldier of the people and you need to be fearless and you need to and you have great purpose and you're confident, and it really mentally prepares you to kind of deal with any kind of stressful situation that would happen during the course of a football match or whatever. And so I've talked about athletic ideology a little bit before on this channel, but I think it's kind of important to talk about when we're talking about women's football, because this is the mentality that the women's football players have, and I think that this gives them a really big advantage when they go into international competitions, particularly at lower levels, because they already have this mental confidence that's instilled in them that was given through this athletic ideological system that existed at the time. So, as you can see in these photographs that I've included, like the upper photograph has Kim Il-sung and the DPRK flag above a bunch of athletes, and so it's a huge part of the system. And then lower you can see I think that is Shin Geum-dan, but if not, it's just a female athlete, and she's holding a book of Kim Il-sung's writings, and they're in front of the Workers' Party flag, and these were published in the 1960s already. So in the 1960s, you could see that this athletic ideological system had already been developed, more or less. And so now we're going to step out of the DPRK and we're going to look at the state of women's football in 1985 internationally, like how it was. So, international women's football in Asia. In 1968, representatives from Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong formed the Asian Ladies Football Confederation, henceforth known, I will call it the ALFC. And this is really amazing because already in 1975, the ALFC hosted their first tournament, the Asian Cup Ladies Football Tournament, and championships were held on a semi-regular basis after that. And I had to include this photograph because it's absolutely amazing, of the first Asian Cup Ladies Football Tournament in Hong Kong. It's just really cool that Asia was one of the first world leaders in beginning women's football and kind of systematizing it. And they even did it without the existing AFC or without FIFA. So it was really a homegrown movement that I think is very admirable for the time. But the DPRK in 1968-1975 were not interested in joining the ALFC. First of all, it had no link to FIFA, meaning that they weren't legitimate enough for the DPRK to kind of earn their international stripes, so to speak, or kind of get international recognition. And the ALFC had no socialist countries. So as you can see, Thailand, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Australia, Singapore, and New Zealand. None of these stations are socialist. And of course, it includes Taiwan. So this China, like mainland China, was not going to participate in this competition, meaning that basically the DPRK didn't really have like a political motive to participate in the same competition that their allies were participating in, so to speak. But eventually, these two issues were solved. In 1984, the ALFC merged with the AFC. So this independent women's football organization merged with the FIFA-linked kind of official men's football organization, and they decided that they were going to host a women's championship under the FIFA banner. So it became kind of internationally legitimized, so to speak. And once every 3 years, beginning in 1986, they started hosting the AFC Women's Championship. And China actually began participating in this championship in 1986. So that kind of opened the door for the DPRK to participate in it as well, because they were also a socialist nation. And so I think that we should also talk about women's football in China, because China has sharing a border with the DPRK, sharing a similar political system, having an off-again, on-again good political relationship, and having some cross-border trade and movement of people, depending on the era. It really does have an effect on what's going on in the DPRK. So like we have to kind of look like, when did women's football start there? And there is one really good article about this, but there's not a ton of information in English. But what I found out was in 1979, spurred by the post-Cultural Revolution liberalism, because the Cultural Revolution really did shut down a lot of factors of society. In 1979, the Shaanxi Provincial Sports Commission founded a professional women's team in Xi'an. So in 1979, the first professional women's team began in China, and this developed very rapidly. So just 3 years after that, the first National Women's Football Invitational was held in Beijing, and then in 1983 and 1984, there were international tournaments going on in China. So from start in 79 to 84, there was just this huge, really fast development of women's football just kind of being introduced to all factors of society. And this would kind of be mirrored in the DPRK. So you have to think that Kim Jong-il was looking at this and he thought, okay, my country can do this too. But let's look outside of Asia for a moment, just to kind of see where the broader world was with women's football in the early 1980s. UEFA, the European Football Association, hosted an unofficial tournament for women entitled the European Competition for Women's Football in 1984. Now, why wasn't it official? Well, it's because they didn't have enough countries participating in it, so that under their rules, they couldn't call it official. But it was basically the first women's football international tournament that kind of went on under the guise of UEFA. So, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it really was official. Let's be real. In 1983, the Oceania Football Confederation held the officially sanctioned OFC Women's Nations Cup for the first time. So there was football going on in Asia, in Europe, and Oceania. So these international developments signaled a continued trend of growth for women's football on a worldwide scale. And this definitely would have been noticed by Kim Jong-il, who wanted to win more gold medals for his country by ordering other people to develop athletes. So we've gone through all this background, and it took a long time, but now we're actually at the point where women's football was formed in the DPRK, so let's look how that happened. So, there's not a lot of sources about how DPRK women's football was made. I mean, I found about 3 books that kind of talk about it very ambiguously. A lot of it has been kind of reformed to sound like perfect propaganda. So we really don't have a ton of exact information on how, why it developed. We just kind of have a few details that we kind of need to extrapolate from. And hopefully one day the archives will be open and we can all kind of figure out how it really, really happened. But here's what I can say. In the late 1970s, women's football was still very much discouraged. It was called disgusting. It was called something that was anti-revolutionary. Then all of a sudden, before the summer of 1985, South Pyongan Province's athletics club formed a women's football team. Why did they do this? I don't know. Who ordered them to do it? I don't know. Why was it in South Pyongan? Why wasn't it in Pyongyang? Could it have been grassroots? I don't know. It's hopefully someday we'll find out. In November of 1985, Kim Jong-il, in a talk with Central Party committee members, said that other countries were encouraging women's football, wrestling, judo, and boxing, but that the DPRK had the best chance of winning in women's football. So all of a sudden, the leader is behind this idea. So it's going to happen in this top-down society. By the 29th of November, 1985, on the order of Kim Jong-il, 18 women's football teams were formed from existing athletics clubs. So basically, you already have these athletics clubs, and they'll have like teams in certain sports. So like, let's just say, for example, this isn't based on reality, but the Kikwanchat team, which is under the Ministry of Railways, they'll have like a basketball team, a volleyball team, and a wrestling team. And then you might say like the Saio, which is attached to the Korean People's Army. They will also have a basketball and volleyball team, but then they might not have a wrestling team, and they'll only have a archery team. And so all these organizations have various teams and various sports. If you look internationally, it's kind of like how CSKA Moscow or even like FC Barcelona, it's not just a socialist thing. Like there will be certain, like FC Barcelona has basketball and football. I believe Bayern München has basketball and football, and just various places in the world where there will be athletics organizations with teams in more than one sport. So Kim Jong-il didn't form women's football teams from nothing. He went to these sporting organizations that already had teams in several sports, and he said, okay, you are going to make a women's football club. And then they made it. They kind of added it on to what they were already doing. So 18 women's football teams were formed, but on 6th February, so just a couple months later, Kim Jong-il made 16 professional teams and 38 teams based at local academies. So we're talking a number of teams over 50. Over 50 teams were just kind of made at the drop of a hat within a few months. And so how were these teams formed? Well, according to a novelization of the lives of some of the early women's football players, there were no expert women footballers, so trainers had to select athletes from other disciplines that possessed an aptitude and constitution suitable for football. So basically like speed skaters or track and field athletes. They would all of a sudden be given the order, basically like, you are now going to become a football player even though you've never played football in your life. And they're like, but I thought I was a pretty good speed skater. And they'd be like, no, you have to start playing football now. And it's unclear whether they really had a choice in the matter or not, because the novelization kind of presents it like they come to their own conclusion, like, okay, I've got to do this for the good of the country, so I'm going to switch to becoming a football player. But these first matches were basically held in secret, or the training was held in secret because they didn't want the players to be embarrassed, and then eventually it was kind of pushed into the public once they had received a few years of training. So the first competitive match occurred in May of 1986, the first public tournament in April of 1988, and the first international friendly in August of 1988, and then in 1990 they got their first medal, a bronze medal, at the 1990 Asian Games. So again, it was just like China. Within the span of 5 years, or they had gone from almost nothing to winning medals. So it was really somewhat of a success story for the regime. But I would like to draw your attention to the picture on the upper picture. This is a picture of the very first kind of exhibition football game. It was held in front of Kim Jong-un, trainers, and nobody else, but it was held at Kim Il-sung Stadium, I believe, or if not a major stadium in Pyongyang, and it was totally empty. No one was allowed to see it. It was really just so Kim Jong-il could see how it was developing. And I believe he saw 2 of these test matches before that they actually went public with everything. And the lower photograph is from a tournament that happened in the late 80s. So it was one of the very first football tournaments, so we can kind of see the nascent DPRK women's football and what it looked like. And so this photograph actually is Kim Jong-il at I think the very first test match. And they didn't allow video of Kim Jong-il at the time, so literally the video stops and they just show this photograph of Kim Jong-il watching the game. But we're here to ask the question, why did Kim Jong-il develop women's football? And so what does the official football history put out by the DPRK say? So it doesn't say this explicitly, but it tacitly implies that the primary motivation behind the development of women's football was to succeed on the international stage. And they demonstrate that they had an awareness, and Kim Jong-il had an awareness of the ALFC and women's football's development in other countries. So those all factored into the decision. We can also look at what Kim Jong-il said in 1986, which was that football was the most popular athletic discipline in both Korea and the world. And he said that if football skills were high, the honor of the country and the nation would shine brightly to the world. So he clearly saw a lot of potential in being good at football. And he obviously probably also thought back to the 1966 World Cup victory by the senior men's team. So he thought, well, women could have kind of this same glory and bring this same glory to the country. In 1989, Kim Jong-il encouraged sending women's football teams abroad more often, even if they had no chance of winning, because he said they needed the experience. So, to put it all together, Kim understood that the process of developing a women's football team would take time, and he saw this as an important political priority. So he said, let's do this, let's take our time, but let's really put all of our effort behind it. And if we do, then we'll succeed and be good at international matches. So that's kind of the reality of why women's football began and why it's so successful. And their continued success after this is kind of the reason why it continues to have support behind it and why they continue to do well. Is because, there are other disciplines like we saw in my other video about baseball. That they weren't so good in certain disciplines, and support for those disciplines totally died out. But disciplines that are genuinely popular domestically, that the country does really well in internationally, are the ones that really will see continued support and continued success throughout the years. So here are the conclusions I came to with this paper and presentation. So why was women's football absent in the DPRK? Football was introduced to Joseon, Korea as a men's sport. As Korea became a Japanese colony in the early 20th century, women privileged enough to go to school participated in sport, but very few schools offered football. The Soviet Union brought in strong ideals of women's liberation, but that liberation was held back by various prejudices, both in the Soviet Union and in Korea at the time, and they included the misconception that football was not suitable for women. Once the DPRK broke away from Soviet guidance, physically fit and socialized women helped labor shortage and increased military readiness. But then those needs lessened and old gender stereotypes began to return, and in the meantime, women's football was not integrated. Eventually, the entire athletic system just became a reflection of the nation's all-encompassing ideology, and everything happened from a top-down level, so there was no potential for grassroots women's football to really emerge. So why did Kim Jong-il suddenly give the order to develop women's football on such a large scale? The country's athleticism was pushed into high gear as the opportunity of glory through international tournaments presented itself. And intensification of athletic development and interest would be a part of the expansion of the number of women's athletic disciplines at the time. But it was really only when the international community pushed women's football onto a larger stage through the tournaments in Europe, Oceania, and Asia that a movement to begin women's football in the DPRK could begin. So even though athletics was a big part of society, women's athletics was a big part of society, ultimately what pushed football into the DPRK was the international movement going on outside of the DPRK, and how the DPRK's leadership saw that international movement and said, there's an opportunity, this will be good for our regime. So really, it's when things that happen internationally that can convince the leaders to do something, that's when change happens in the DPRK, and that's kind of like the point I want to make that kind of ties it all together with the major political situation. So as you can see, athletics can really tell you something about politics or about the country's government. It doesn't always just have to be about athletics. And so kind of in accordance with that, can we understand more about the DPRK's decision-making and processes for societal change in the DPRK through this analysis? In a top-down authoritarian system like the DPRK, major changes are very often only going to come from the highest levels. Change only occurred because a strong national women's football team aligned with the priorities of the state. The fact that this change opened up new opportunities for women to enjoy football was a mere side effect, And this did not factor into the decision in the slightest. So this was definitely not a decision made for feminism. This was a decision made because the regime thought it would be good for the glory of the country. Feminism did not factor into the decision whatsoever. And like I said, all decisions are made with the goal of maintaining state power on the national and international stage. Everything else comes secondary to that. That's my assertion. And although that it is true that Kim Jong-il gave the order for women's football development, it is also true that the rapid development of women's football internationally in the 70s and 80s had a strong effect on his decision-making. So this is the power of international movements, and this is how international movements can sway social change in even this isolated state, kind of rephrasing what I said earlier. But yeah, I mean, that's the main point. And so that's kind of why I included this photograph of an old East German magazine or book or newspaper. It says Freundschaft siegt. It says friendship wins, because I think that international movements, when they are done in the right way, can actually sway the leadership of a country that you might not agree with to kind of make a decision that you agree with. So even though you might not support the DPRK as a regime, what happened with the international movement of women's football made them begin women's football, even if their reasoning for starting it isn't necessarily advantageous. Now women can play football in the DPRK, and that's more positive than women not playing football in the DPRK. So I think it's just kind of something to think about when we talk about these issues. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of my long presentation. Thank you so much for watching this whole thing. I'll kind of include as an addendum kind of my experience giving this presentation. It was amazing to be able to go to the conference in Cyprus and speak amongst a whole bunch of academic people. But I would say to somebody who is getting into academics, there's kind of a good and a bad to doing something so specialized like athletics in the DPRK, because when people do DPRK studies, it's normally like security, politics, religion in the DPRK, humanitarian rights, things like that. Or somebody kind of does something, but then they kind of think about the DPRK as on the side. It's rare for someone to kind of go into a social aspect of the DPRK and really study it. So when I went into this conference, it was mostly presentations about how the North dealt with the South and divided nations. And then you kind of had my weird presentation on the side about women's football. And so when they were looking for papers to publish for the conference, I wasn't high enough on the list to really get considered for inclusion, because they're like, this doesn't fit into our theme at all. So like the advantage of doing something so strange and so specialized in academia is that people think, oh, that's a new idea, that's a fresh idea, and you're not competing with anybody else because no one else is writing about it. So they're like, okay, we'll accept you for a conference. But then, when they're considering like what's the best paper, or does this paper fit into a certain theme, then you start to lose out, because people will think, okay, athletics, they're not that important, or they'll think like, oh, this paper is so much different than all the other political papers that we just don't have a reason to include it. And so there's kind of an up and down for doing this. So I think that's something to consider if anybody is a potential academic, and that's kind of what I learned through this. Sometimes it doesn't matter how well something is written or how good it is, it really just matters whether it fits certain parameters. And in this case, this paper wasn't published because it didn't fit certain parameters. But the great thing about doing YouTube is that I can bring it out to the public. You guys can see what I worked on, and ultimately it will be seen by more people than people that are going to read that publication, I think, in the end. And it's a little bit more lively. So anyway, that's it for me this week. Next week I will try to get a video out that's a little bit more dynamic, not just a presentation, but I was traveling a lot through this week and last week. So I just didn't have enough time to do kind of a real video, but hopefully we'll get more interesting, visually dynamic and amazing topics out to you right here on the DPRK Athletics channel. Please subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any questions, feel free to go down into the comments. Feel free to join our Discord and join our discussion about DPRK Athletics. That is all. Stay well.